Hello there. The EU is in its death throes, so in one last act of vindictive hatred towards democracy, Brussels is set to punish its EU citizens and their countries for daring to assert themselves as nation-states. Evil and authoritarian. The Brussels hierarchy is about to berate up to 10 EU member states for disobeying their diktats. Just as nationalist fervour appears to be gripping EU member states, many of those member states are about to be punished by the Brussels bureaucrats for failing to keep within their tight framework of rules. And large fines could be applied to any member state that fails to toe the line. Yes, more proof that Brexit was the right decision, as Brussels flexes its member state subduing muscles once again. And amongst the hapless countries to draw the ire of Brussels could well be Belgium, France and Italy, reports France 24. The EU's executive arm, the EU Commission, has threatened to launch excessive deficit procedures, which kickstart a process forcing a debt-overloaded country to negotiate a plan with Brussels to get back on track, it says. Excessive deficit procedures. Negotiate a plan with the Eurocrats. Sounds very scary, people. Austerity in France to come, perhaps. So the institution that gave us open borders and is hell-bent on replacing the European Christian population with another demographic now has its eyes set upon crushing nation-state finances. Consider, right now, France, like the UK, has politicians marching around the country during an election period, promising all sorts of giveaways to tempt their voters. And have you noticed how the French and UK mainstream press and politicians obsess about these elections being all about tax? About the elections always being about the economy? Is the mainstream press just blindly following the 1992 political mantra of Bill Clinton strategist James Carville that elections are always about the economy, stupid? But I'm not so sure about these 2024 EU Parliament elections and the UK and French domestic elections. I wonder how many of those voters out there would be very happy to take a hit to the economy in order to secure their culture and way of life and safeguard it for the future, for their children and grandchildren. None of the big press outlets seem to have factored that in. Or are they not talking about that for fear of identifying a real truth behind our current national unease? Are they worried that talking about it could clarify and crystallise that truth in the minds of ordinary people? Just a thought. At least in the UK we have the freedom to not be worried about EU budget rules anymore. But they do in France, and that is causing them problems. With the result that right now France's bond spreads have blown out and are now trading wider than Portugal, reports Axios.com, and its stock market has sold off to the point at which London once again has the highest market capitalisation in Europe. And it goes on to say that London's square mile of financial services will have to build an extra 16 or so million square feet of office space over the next 15 years to keep up with demand. These things matter. And today we find that the UK CPI inflation rate has hit the 2% Bank of England target. Not that that will save Rishi and his Tories, of course. No, they are all well charred toast. And the pundits are all, of course, warning that voting for the far right in France will make things economically worse. Analysts increasingly expect to see a far-right majority in the French Parliament, which could increase fiscal spending, decrease funding for Ukraine, and break ranks with the pan-European economic and industrial policies, says Axios. And the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire told us yesterday that a win for Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party would spell doom for France. Opening the floodgates to public spending at a time when we should be restoring our accounts will lead to France being placed under the supervision of Brussels and the International Monetary Fund, he told the newspaper Le Monde. The next step is already written: austerity and massive tax hikes. Hang on, wait a minute. Isn't that exactly what the Brussels Eurocrats already have in store for France? You know, those excessive budget deficit procedures I talked about a minute ago. And that all came about under Macron and his team. These lefty politicians assume people have the memory span of a goldfish. Now, what was I talking about? Oh, yes. So the French finance minister is out to scare the people away from Le Pen. Ooh, one surmises he's out to save his job. And also one assumes that any French cultural concerns the people have are of zero consequence for him. Now, some might argue that countries should follow prudent budget policies. So having the lovely, kindly EU at the helm would keep everyone on the straight and narrow. But they had to suspend the whole lot of those rules during the pandemic, because those rules were totally at odds with what was required to follow the expert scientific advice. And now that the EU and the UK have to deal with the outfall of decades of EU and domestic government woke lefty nonsense, those rules are still out of kilter today with what is really required. The bottom line is we need to make work pay and make our work far more productive. But both of those are totally at odds with the me, now woke lefty culture, where employers are there to service the needs of the employees, not to make a profit from customers. Anyway, the real truth for those within the EU is that it is the EU system of policy making that has been making all the decisions for them, and that is the system that set the rules that are breaking them now. And the fact that the people might vote during national elections against those rules must be screaming at everyone that the one-size-fits-all EU approach is far from the correct approach, surely. Now, we all know that the Labour Party of Keir the Neela Starmer and Angela Growler Rayner wants to see the UK cosy up to the EU, but the EU does not impose VAT on private education. So would the Neela have to U-turn on that policy too, just to get a few tweaks to the Brexit trade deal? But, funny old thing, some companies that run UK private educational establishments are now investing their money into EU private education. Funny how these things work out, isn't it? We could see UK rich kids being sent to the EU to be educated, and at the same time we are importing ever more university students into the UK. It's all a bit confusing, isn't it? But one little snippet of information that might have passed you by is that the EU Council of Ministers has voted in favour of a new nature restoration law that the EU Parliament has already voted for. The EU on Monday proved it can still pass a green bill. All it took was a rogue Austrian minister willing to throw away her job, get sued by her own government, and potentially tank her entire coalition. Yes, the Austrian Environment Minister, Leonor Gewessler, defied her now angry Prime Minister, Alexander De Croo, to tip the balance in favour of the bill. All this unity, they just can't get enough of it, can they? And once that regulation comes into force, EU member states have 2 years to get even more eco-plans in place. So I suspect Keir Starmer will have his pen out ready to sign the UK into compliance too. And I somehow think he'll get diddly squat in return, just more UK economy and agriculture destroying rules to obey, rules that the likes of China, India and the US will not have to follow. But it would allow Starmer to blame Brussels for any negative outcomes, wouldn't it?